The first snow of November came early that year. I sat in the waiting room of the specialist's office in Hamilton, watching flakes dissolve against the glass before they ever had a chance to settle. My son lay in a rehabilitation center 2 blocks away, learning how to exist in a body that no longer worked the way it was supposed to. He was 39 years old. He coached his daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He made the best pancakes I had ever tasted. And 8 weeks ago, a faulty scaffold on a construction site in Mississauga had taken all of that away in the time it takes to draw a breath. The surgeon had been kind when she explained it. Daniel had a spinal compression injury, incomplete, which meant there was still function, still hope, but the conventional therapy covered by OHIP would give him, at best, partial recovery. There was a clinical program in Minneapolis, experimental spinal regeneration therapy. 18 months. The outcomes were remarkable, she said. The cost was $312,000 Canadian, not covered, not eligible for provincial funding, not approved. Just a number sitting on a piece of paper that might as well have been written in a language I did not speak. I was 63 years old. I had retired 2 years earlier after 31 years as a school librarian in Guelph. My pension was modest but sufficient for one person living quietly. I had $40,000 in savings and a house with a small mortgage. I loved my son and my granddaughter more than I had ever loved anything in my life. It was not close to enough. A man in a dark coat appeared beside me. He was perhaps 50, precise in the way that lawyers are precise, every detail considered. He said my name the way people do when they have rehearsed it. I looked up. "My name is Peter Arsenault," he said. "I represent a man named James Calloway. He would like to speak with you about your son's situation." I had never heard of James Calloway in my life. I told the man so. Mr. Calloway is aware of that. He understands this may seem unusual. He asks only that you hear him out. He pulled a card from his coat pocket and held it out to me. He would cover all of Daniel's treatment expenses. The full amount, in Minneapolis, for as long as necessary. My heart did something I was not prepared for. It lurched forward the way it does when you almost miss a step in the dark. "Why would a stranger do that?" I asked. "Mr. Calloway is not well. He has perhaps 4 to 6 months. He is a private man, and he would rather not spend whatever time remains entirely alone. He is asking for a companion. Legally, yes, a wife, but in every practical sense, simply someone to share the house with. When he passes, you would be entirely free. Everything for your son would already be arranged." I was a librarian. I had read every variation of this story in fiction. I knew exactly how it sounded. And yet I thought about Daniel. I thought about my granddaughter Lily drawing get-well cards with her crayons and taping them to his window because she was not old enough to understand that he could not see them from his bed. "Take the evening," Peter Arsenault said, setting his card on the armrest. "I need your answer by 9 tomorrow morning." I sat beside my son that night for 3 hours. He was awake, which was both better and worse than when he slept. He knew about the money. He knew about the gap between what the province would cover and what the program cost. He had done the math himself in his hospital bed with his phone because he had always been practical, even when it hurt him to be. "Don't," he said, when I started to speak. "I have to tell you something." "Mom?" "Don't. I'm going to do it," I said quietly. "I just wanted you to know why." He turned his face toward the window. His jaw was tight in the way it had been since he was 16 and trying not to cry in front of me. I took a taxi home through streets that smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves, and I made my decision in the dark of my kitchen with a cup of tea I forgot to drink. The wedding was held in a notary's office in Oakville on a gray Thursday afternoon. There were no flowers. There was no music. Peter Arsenault served as witness along with James's housekeeper, a woman named Frances Bouchard who had worked for him for 27 years and who pressed my hand between both of hers when it was done, the way my own mother used to do. James sat in a wheelchair. That was the first thing that surprised me. I had not asked enough questions about the nature of his illness. I had assumed something internal, invisible, the kind of sickness that hollows you from the inside without announcing itself on the surface. But he was visibly diminished. He was 68 years old and he looked older, his face pale and deeply lined, his hands trembling slightly on the armrests. He had been a successful architect. There were photographs in the office lobby of buildings he had designed, glass and timber structures along Georgian Bay that had won awards in the 90s. The man in the wheelchair looked like someone had taken all the weight out of him. "Thank you," he said, after we signed. His voice was thin but measured. "I know what you are giving up to be here." "I am giving up very little," I said. "And my son is going to walk again." Something moved across his face that I could not name. "He will," James said. "I have already spoken to the clinic." We drove north in a hired car, James and Francis and I, up through Barrie and into Muskoka, where the trees had gone bare and the lake sat still and iron gray between the rocks. His property was on the water, a large timber frame house set back into the birch trees with a dock that reached into the lake like a long arm. It was beautiful in the way that very private places are beautiful, a beauty that does not invite you in. "Your rooms are on the upper level," he said, when we arrived. "Francis will show you. Mine are down here. I do not use the stairs anymore." He wheeled himself toward the back of the house without looking at me. Francis caught my expression. "He is not being rude," she said, softly. "He has simply forgotten how to have someone in the house. Come, I will make you tea." The kitchen was the warmest room in the building. It smelled of something baking and of the particular pine and lake smell that is specific to Muskoka in late autumn. Francis moved through it with the confidence of someone who had made it entirely her own over the decades. "How long have you been with him?" I asked. "Since before his wife died," she said. 27 years. Eleanor passed 12 years ago. Cancer. They had no children. He closed himself into the work after that. All those years building and designing. And then the illness came and the work stopped. And now it is just this house. And what time is left." "What kind of illness?" Francis set a mug in front of me. "Dilated cardiomyopathy," she said. "The heart muscle weakens. It stops pumping properly. The doctor said 6 months when they diagnosed him, and it has been nearly 5. She said it without drama, the way people say things when they have already had time to absorb the grief of them. The first 2 weeks were quiet in a way I had not experienced since living alone. I did not see James at meals. He worked at his drafting table during the days, which surprised me, an architect still designing buildings he would not live to see built. Francis would bring him a tray. Sometimes I heard him on the phone, speaking in a low, careful voice. He sounded like someone managing the end of things. I drove to Hamilton twice a week to see my son. The clinic in Minneapolis had confirmed his enrollment. The transfer was being arranged. Each time I sat beside Daniel's bed, I watched his face change incrementally, the way fear recedes when certainty arrives, even certainty as strange as this. "Your husband," he said one afternoon. "Mum, is he decent to you at least?" "He barely speaks to me," I said. "But yes, he is decent." The night that changed things came in the 3rd week. I had gone to bed early and woken at 2 in the morning to a sound I could not immediately identify. A scraping, then a crash, then silence that felt wrong. I put on my robe and went downstairs. The door to James's study was open. He was on the floor beside his desk, the wheelchair on its side, one arm reaching toward the lower drawer. His face was white and covered in sweat. I crossed the room and knelt beside him. "I do not need," he started. "Don't," I said, and got my arms under his shoulders. I was not young and he was not light, but I had spent years lifting boxes of books in a school where the budget did not extend to dollies or assistants, and I managed to get him upright and into the chair. His hands were shaking badly. "The drawer," he said. "Blue bottle." I found it and put it in his hands. He took 2 tablets and sat back with his eyes closed. "I should call an ambulance," I said. "No hospitals." His voice was flat but certain. "They cannot do anything more than they have already done. I would rather be here." I pulled the desk chair over and sat down across from him. We stayed like that for a while, the 2 of us in the lamplight while the lake moved outside in the dark. "You are worse than they predicted," I said. It was not a question. He opened his eyes and looked at me. Really looked at me, for what I realized was the first time. "Yes," he said, faster than expected. "How much time do you think you actually have?" He was quiet for a long moment. 2 months, perhaps less. I felt something shift in my chest. He was a stranger. I had married him for money, for my son, for a practical and desperate reason that I had no shame about. And yet sitting there on the floor of his study at 2 in the morning, watching him struggle to hold a glass of water, I felt something that had nothing to do with any transaction. "Let me help you to bed," I said. After that night, he started coming to breakfast. Francis would make oatmeal and fruit and strong coffee, and the three of us would sit at the kitchen table as the light came across the lake. James was quiet at first, careful, like a man who had forgotten the ordinary rhythm of conversation and was relearning it. But gradually he began to speak. He told me about the buildings, about Eleanor, who had been a ceramicist and had kept the studio at the back of the property full of color right until the end. About growing up in New Brunswick, the son of a fisherman who thought architecture was the kind of word people used to confuse him on purpose. I told him about the library, about 30 years of putting the right book into the right child's hands and watching something open in their face. About my late husband Robert, who had died of a heart attack 11 years ago and left me with a son to finish raising and a grief I had learned to carry rather than put down. "Why did you stop?" James asked one morning. "Stop what?" "Reading. To yourself. Not to children." "I still read." "No, I mean the way you used to." He was looking at his coffee cup. "Francis told me you mentioned once that you used to read for hours as a young woman." "Francis talks a great deal," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile. I read to him that evening. We sat in the main room with the fire going and the lake invisible beyond the windows, and I read from a novel I had brought with me, a Canadian author, a story set in the North. He sat in his chair with his eyes closed, and I could not tell at first if he was listening or sleeping. But when I paused to turn the page, he said, "Go on, please," in a voice that was very quiet and very present. Francis watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with an expression that was difficult to look at directly. "He is smiling," she said one afternoon while we were washing dishes. "Do you know I had forgotten what it looked like?" Something was bothering me, though. A detail I kept moving past and then returning to. James was declining faster than any heart condition timeline I had read about, and I had read extensively because I am a librarian and that is what I do when something frightens me. But the specific pattern of his deterioration did not match what I found. The trembling, the fatigue, the pallor, the sudden episodes of nausea that would come over him after meals and then pass. These were not the steady worsening of cardiomyopathy. They were episodic, cyclical. And his nephew came every Sunday. Trevor Calloway was 44, sandy-haired, cheerful in the practiced way of people who have learned that cheerfulness is useful. He was James's only living relative, the son of a younger brother who had died years ago. He managed a commercial real estate portfolio in Toronto. He brought James vitamins every visit, a small bag of supplements from a health food store on Queen Street, and James took them without question because Trevor was family, and family was something James had very little of. I noticed that James was often worse on Sundays after Trevor left. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that correlation was not causation, that I was an anxious woman looking for explanations in the wrong places. Then I found the medications. It was a Saturday morning in December. James was resting. I went to the bathroom on the main floor to replace a roll of tissue and found the cabinet open, bottles lined across the shelf. I counted 11. Different physicians, different pharmacies, different dates, all within the past 4 months. I am not a medical professional, but I was a librarian for 31 years, which means I know how to read a label, how to cross-reference, how to ask whether information is consistent. These were not consistent. 3 of the bottles were prescribed by doctors in different cities. 2 of them listed interactions with each other that should have flagged immediately. 1 of them was not a cardiac medication at all. I took a photograph of each label with my phone. That night, I lay awake and thought about Trevor's visits, about the supplements, about the way Peter Arsenault always had a reason for James to reschedule his cardiology follow-ups, about the fact that Trevor was, as Francis had mentioned once in passing, the sole beneficiary of James's estate, a man who had spent 40 years building a legacy and had no children to leave it to. I thought about what $300 million in assets meant to a man managing a struggling commercial real estate portfolio in a market that had not been kind for 2 years. I got up at 5 in the morning and drove to the 24-hour Shoppers Drug Mart in Bracebridge. I asked to speak with the pharmacist on duty, a young man named Rajan, who looked like I had interrupted something important, and then looked again at the photographs on my phone and stopped looking like that entirely. "This one," he said, pointing to the label I had photographed twice because I wanted to be sure. "This is not a cardiac support medication." He paused. This is used in very specific clinical contexts. At this dosage, long-term, in someone with an existing heart condition, he met my eyes. It would accelerate the deterioration, make it appear as though the underlying condition was progressing naturally. The other symptoms, the nausea, the tremors, the fatigue, those would present as consistent with late-stage cardiomyopathy. Could it kill someone? I asked. My voice was steady. I was surprised by it. Over several months? At this dosage? Yes, almost certainly. I sat in my car in the Shoppers parking lot for 4 minutes. The temperature outside was -12. I watched my breath fog the windshield, then I called 911. The police came to the house at 7:30. Francis let them in and then sat down at the kitchen table and did not stand up again for a very long time. James woke to strangers in his hallway and was, at first, confused and then frightened in a way I had not seen him frightened before. I sat beside him on the edge of his bed and held his hand while the officers explained what was happening. His hand was very cold. They took blood samples at the house and transported him to the hospital in Huntsville. The testing confirmed what Rajan had suspected. Traces of a compound used in very specific pharmaceutical contexts, administered in accumulating doses over approximately 4 months. Also found in the supplements Trevor had been providing. Also found in a second form in the vitamins Peter Arsenault, who was not merely a lawyer but a man who had known Trevor for 15 years, had encouraged James to take alongside his prescriptions. Trevor was arrested at his condominium in Toronto that evening, Peter Arsenault 2 hours later in Mississauga. The investigators found emails, detailed ones, discussions about the estate, about timing, about the projected trajectory of James's decline. A letter of intent from a private equity firm who had expressed interest in acquiring James's architectural legacy holdings. Trevor had been negotiating the sale for 8 months. James spent 3 weeks in hospital in Huntsville and then a further 2 weeks at Toronto General, while the cardiology team assessed the actual state of his heart. What they found, once the compound had cleared his system, was not a dying man. He has a manageable arrhythmia, the cardiologist explained, well within treatable parameters. The damage from the compound is significant but recoverable. With proper medication and monitoring, there is no reason this man cannot live another 15-20 years. I was sitting in the chair beside James's bed when the doctor said this. I watched James's face move through something I had never seen on it before. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. Relief. But underneath it, something more complicated. The particular expression of a man who had spent 5 months saying goodbye to his life and was now being asked to take it back. The doctor left. We sat in silence for a while. "You knew," James said finally. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the ceiling. "You paid attention. You asked questions. I am a librarian," I said. "It is what we do." The corner of his mouth moved. And then, slowly, it became something more. He laughed, quietly and carefully, as though he had not used the mechanism in some time and wanted to be sure it still worked. "It did. Margaret," he said. My name in his voice sounded different than it had at the beginning, less formal, more particular. "I know our arrangement was—" He stopped, started again. "I understand if you want to leave. I will ensure everything for Daniel is fully covered regardless. You have my word. The clinic, the full course of treatment, everything is already in place and I will not remove it. I want you to know that." I thought about the nights reading by the fire, about the morning he told me about Eleanor, his voice careful and fond in equal measure, about the way he had started saving newspaper clippings for me, articles he thought I would find interesting, tucking them under my coffee cup before I came downstairs, about the particular quality of the silence we had learned to share, the kind of silence that is not empty but full. I thought about being 63 years old and knowing the difference between the silences that drain you and the ones that do not. "I am not leaving," I said. He looked at me then. "I mean that," I said. "Not because of Daniel. Not because of the house or the arrangement. I am not leaving because, against all reasonable expectation, I do not want to." His eyes were wet. He looked, for just a moment, like the man in those photographs in the lobby, the one who had designed beautiful things along the water. "I would like to try," he said. "If you were willing, To make this something real, I took his hand. It was warmer than it had been in the house on the night I found him on the floor. I could feel his pulse, steady and actual beneath my fingers. "I am willing," I said. The legal proceedings took most of the following year. Trevor was charged with aggravated assault and fraud. Peter Arsenault faced disbarment proceedings in addition to criminal charges. The evidence was thorough. The sentences were meaningful. James recovered slowly and then all at once, the way that healing sometimes happens, gradually and then in a rush. Color returned to his face. His hands stopped trembling. He went back to his drafting table, and the work that came out of it was different from the work that had come before, lighter somehow, more interested in how people move through spaces than in how spaces impress people who look at them from the outside. Daniel flew to Minneapolis in February. I went with him on the first visit and held his hand in the clinic the way I had held it in the hospital room, the way I had held it since he was small. The program was everything the surgeon had promised. By spring, he was beginning to feel sensation he had been told he might never recover. By summer, he was standing with assistants. By the following autumn, he walked into my kitchen under his own power and stood at the stove and made pancakes while Lily sat at the table and drew him a picture of it happening, because she wanted to document the moment even though she was only 7 and not entirely sure how documentation worked. James sat across from Lily and helped her spell the words she wanted to add to the drawing, and I stood at the window and felt something I do not have a precise word for. Gratitude is not quite right. Gratitude implies you know whom to thank, and I was not sure I could account for all of it, the whole improbable chain of events that had led to this kitchen on this morning. Lily gave James the drawing when it was finished. He framed it and hung it in his study, beside the architectural renderings of the Georgian Bay buildings. It looked entirely right there. In the spring, James proposed something. He had been thinking, he said, about the gaps he kept encountering in his work, the number of people in the province, in the country, who navigated serious illness or injury without adequate support, who fell into the space between what provincial health covered and what was actually needed, who had no one to advocate for them, no one paying close enough attention. A foundation, he said, named for Eleanor. Grants for families facing medical costs that fall outside coverage, legal support for navigating the system, access to specialists who are too expensive for people managing on a pension or a retail salary or nothing. It was, I told him, the best idea I had heard in years. We announced it in June. Frances cried at the announcement, which she said she had not planned to do and which she did anyway, with tremendous dignity. We moved to a smaller house in the fall. Not smaller in a diminished way, smaller in the way of a place that has been chosen rather than inherited. It was in Guelph, near the school where I had spent 31 years, near the neighborhood where Daniel and Lily lived, near the Saturday morning farmers market that Frances declared far superior to the one in Bracebridge. James built a studio in the back garden for me, not for art, but for books. A small reading room with proper light and deep shelves, and a chair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. He said I had spent 30 years building reading rooms for other people, and it seemed only reasonable that I should have one of my own. The first Saturday we were fully settled. I sat in that chair with a novel and a cup of tea and listened to the sounds of James in the kitchen, attempting to learn to make the oatmeal the way Frances made it, which he never quite mastered, and Frances in the garden talking to the plants the way she always did, and Lily's voice somewhere nearby, high and clear and absolutely certain about something, the way children are. The foundation received its first application in October. A woman in Sudbury, 51 years old, her husband had a neurological condition. The therapy that could slow it was not covered under the provincial formulary. The cost was beyond anything they could manage on a teacher's salary. James and I read the letter together at the kitchen table. We did not need to discuss it. We wrote back to her the same evening. There is a moment in every winter when the snow comes not as intrusion but as arrival, the particular silence of the first real snowfall, the way it changes the quality of light and sound and seems to press everything closer together. I have always loved that moment. I was born in Ontario, and I have spent my whole life learning the rhythms of a northern winter, the way the cold makes things both harder and cleaner. I thought about that waiting room in Hamilton in the first November, the snow dissolving against the glass, my son 2 blocks away and $300,000 between him and walking again, the feeling of being at the very end of what I could do on my own. I did not know, sitting in that chair, that paying attention would become the most important thing I would do in the years that followed. Not just to the medication bottles in a bathroom cabinet, but to everything. To the man who forgot to eat because he was designing something beautiful. To the nephew who smiled too carefully. To the woman in Sudbury who needed someone to notice her letter in the same way that I had needed someone to notice mine. James found me in the studio one evening in December, standing at the window with a mug of tea, watching the snow come down on the garden. "You have that look," he said. "What look?" "The one where you are cataloging something." I smiled. "I suppose I am." He came to stand beside me. Through the window, the garden was quiet and white and full of the particular piece of things that have been through difficulty and come out the other side intact. "I was thinking about attention," I said. "About how it is the thing that saves people. Not money, not luck, not the right circumstances. Just someone noticing. Just someone caring enough to ask whether something is right." He put his arm around me. He was warm in the specific way of someone whose body had learned to be warm again after a long time of forgetting how. "You noticed," he said. "We both did," I told him. "That is the whole point." The snow kept falling. In the kitchen, Frances was making something that smelled like her apple cake, the one she only made on occasions she deemed significant, and I could hear James's breathing beside me, steady and real and entirely present. And I thought about all the forms a life can take when you are not watching, about how sometimes the worst possible door opens into something you could not have imagined asking for. I am 64 years old. I have been a librarian and a mother and a widow and, now, a wife in a way that means something I did not plan for it to mean. I have learned that the stories worth telling are rarely the ones we would have written for ourselves. They are the ones we stumble into in waiting rooms and notaries' offices and pharmacy parking lots at 5 in the morning when we are frightened and paying very close attention. Pay attention to the people beside you. Ask whether something is right. Care enough to notice when it is not. That is how we find our way back to each other. That is how we save each other. Every single day, we still do.